Good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth episode of Sector Stream, CIEEM's new webinar series. Today, we have an expert panel for you. We're going to talk about COVID-19 and the response from the non-consultancy sector. I'll go through how we ask questions, introduce the panel to you. We'll then go into a discussion session. We're going to do things a little bit differently today. So we're going to have a discussion amongst the panel, but please feel free to ask your questions, and my colleague Amber will insert those into the conversation. We'll give you a quick preview of episode 5 coming up in a few weeks' time as well, and then just a thanks at the end. So asking questions, please use the question and answer, the Q&A button, either at the top right or sometimes at the bottom, depending on, I think, what device you're using, and then submit it using the text box. Please don't use the chat function. We'll be checking the Q&A section, but the chat works a little bit differently. It's better for us to use the Q&A. So the panel today, we have Martin Evans from Natural Resources Wales, covering the SNCO portion of things and a Welsh perspective. We have John Rose, an academic perspective, Sheffield Hallam University. Paul Scott from over in Ireland, works for the Irish government, here today in an independent capacity though. Steph West from the Natural History Museum in London, and Paul Wilkinson from the Nottingham Wildlife Trust. So, go into the panel discussion. Please do ask questions. My colleague Amber is online. She'll be sifting those and posing those to the panel as well. And we'll get into the discussion. I'll shift us back over to the panel so you can see us all. Right. So if I could start, can we just get an introduction from each of you? John, would you like to go first?
So yeah, my name's John Rose. I'm course leader for the MSc Environmental Management at Sheffield Hallam University. Been there 25 years now, came originally from consultancy, and I also chair MAC for CIEEM. That's Membership and Admissions Committee, sorry.
Great, thanks. Steph.
Hi, so I'm Steph West. I'm UK Biodiversity Training Manager over at the Angela Marmont Centre for UK Biodiversity at the Natural History Museum. Our team sits within the Life Sciences Department at the museum, which is one of our core research departments for the Science Directorate. Previously, I've been involved with CIEEM for, gosh, many years now. I'm currently on the Training, Education and Careers Development Committee, and I've worked really throughout the ecology sector in a lot of different roles over the years, but I've been at the museum for, gosh, since 2014 now, I think.
Thank you. Paul Scott.
Hi there, yeah, Paul Scott is my name. I'm Environmental Planning Manager with the Department of Planning, Housing and Local Government in Ireland. Prior to this job, I was an ecological consultant for 15, 16 years. So now firmly plunked behind a desk rather than running around. I still do chase bats and involved in the Irish Nepesia's pit monitoring programme. And yes, I'm in the Irish government, but I'm representing just my own personal views on this particular day.
Thank you. Martin.
Yeah, hi, I'm wedged in between Ireland and England then, the little sliver of land called Wales. Yeah, I'm Martin Evans. I'm head of operations for South West Wales, so one of 6 what we call heads of place responsible for the entirety of NRW's brief. You know, we're an integrated, sponsored public body. So we do pretty much everything, and I'm responsible for everything on the patch. So it's been a really interesting experience thus far. But as well as being a kind of geographical head of operations, I've got organisation-wide responsibility for ecosystem resilience, which is where all our nature conservation and biodiversity work comes in. So I've got that responsibility wider than my patch, which is an interesting kind of duality, really.
Thank you very much. And Paul.
Yeah, hi everyone. Paul Wilkinson, I'm Chief Executive of the Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust. Also, as part of that role, we have a wholly owned trading subsidiary called EMEC, East Mids Environmental Consultancy, and I'm the MD of that consultancy too. Full member of CIEEM and member of the governing board. And before I joined the Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust, I was head of policy for the UK in the UK Office of the Wildlife Trusts over in Newark.
Thanks very much. So starting off generally, should we talk a bit about the sort of non-consultancy sector generally and what the effect has been of COVID-19? Shall we start with, let's say, with England first, and go with John, Steph, and Paul Wilkinson, maybe. I don't know if one of you wants to kick off with a general view on how things have changed or the impact.
Shall I start? Well, in terms of the universities, it's clearly caused massive changes for us. We were close to the end of the teaching year, but basically universities have just had to close down in terms of face-to-face contact. So all lectures had to move online. A lot of residential field trips would have been happening in sort of April, May. Those, I think, pretty much entirely, certainly ours have all had to stop. I think that's the case. And so it's been that real sort of rush to think, how can we make sure we deliver that end of semester experience online, virtually, having to learn a whole lot of new techniques for delivering material online rather than face to face. And how can we replace that field trip experience with something still of equal value? How can we ensure that students' assessments are still fair and still reflect their ability? So it's had to be a huge, rapid change for the immediate. And then obviously looking forward, how do we deliver the next academic year? We've seen Cambridge University have announced they're going all virtual for the next year. We haven't gone that far, and I don't think many others have. We're sort of looking probably largely virtual till Christmas, and then but reviewing things as they go. So huge changes for us.
Does that seem to be so I've seen a few other universities have said their first semester will be online and then they're reviewing. Is that more of a general approach to start with?
As far as I know, yes. Things are changing very rapidly at the moment, but it's just when you do the maths of how many students you can fit in seminar rooms and maintain social distancing, the numbers just drop, and it's just barely becomes feasible. The number of repeat sessions you'd have to do there aren't enough hours in the day. So for the short term, I think up until Christmas, yes, it's going to be largely virtual, and then let's hope there isn't a second spike and second semester can be more normal, but that's something all universities are just going to have to assess as it goes.
Okay, thanks. Steph, obviously the museum is closed, but what other changes have you seen?
Well, I mean, obviously the biggest, most dramatic closure was the actual closure of both South Kensington site, our Tring site, and our off-site storage facility as well for our collections. So that was a very, very quick change for all of us, because that closed to most staff as well as to all of our visitors. So that was obviously the most direct, immediate effect. But of course that has huge knock-on impacts on not just people being able to access our research, our science, and the fantastic, obviously, experience that is the Natural History Museums across both South Kensington and Tring, but has huge knock-on implications for our research as well. We've had to delay and change a lot of our research practice, particularly as we've gone into the field season this year. That's dramatically altered what we are and aren't able to do. A lot of our work happens in our laboratories as well, and also our work with partners. We work across multiple different sectors with many, many different partners, and of course they have all been impacted equally by closures and furloughs and changes to working practices. So that's had a dramatic impact on how we can undertake that collaborative aspect to our research. As John has quite correctly stated, we have PhD students who work with us as well, and that's had a big knock-on effect in terms of their ability to study, to undertake their research, people who were intended to use our laboratories. And of course it's affected people's ability to access our collections Our collections are completely closed for research. People can't come in. Not only can we not use them ourselves, but we also can't have visiting researchers in the same way and enabling research across the rest of the world, as we would ordinarily be doing. We do have some, facilities which enable some of our collections to be studied online. We've been working over the last few years on this huge digitisation project, which has got some of our collections digitised, so people can still access collections in some ways, but of course for some people that's not necessarily going to be their specimens that they needed, or indeed how they needed to be able to access collections. So similar to as John was describing for Sheffield, we're working on strategies for what reopening might look like, what we can reopen, both for the public, but also for our staff and our researchers as well. So it's been something of a, wide-reaching impact across all of aspects of our work.
Thanks. There's a few things in there I think we'll come back to, sort of field work and reopening and all that. But Paul Wilkinson, how the sort of charity sector has been a big impact, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, the first wave of impact was around closing our offices and moving the staff into remote working situation. We did have a little bit of a trial of that for around a week or so in advance before the government finally enforced the stay at home. So that's been a challenge in its own right for everyone, I think, getting used to formats like Zoom and all of the other technologies, as well as then starting to understand new language. Who would have known what furlough was 2 or 3 months ago? So there's been a whole challenge of keeping on top of the guidance, keeping on top of the ever-changing situation. It's felt very fast-moving, it's felt very challenging, it's felt very stressful, but also at times quite exhilarating in that respect as well. I suppose the other kind of part of that first wave was closing down our volunteering activity. So we have volunteer groups going out on our sites on a regular basis. Just in Notts alone, we've got 400 volunteers that give their time for us. So that's everyone from helping in our kind of corporate team, doing kind of research around businesses, as well as people out on site doing habitat maintenance, as well as people coming and manning our reception, helping keep in touch with our members. And so we've got volunteers involved in almost every aspect of our work, and removing those 400 people from our delivery has a massive impact. We've also then, we as the Notts Trust have got 2 visitor centres, very popular. One of our visitor centres gets around 200,000 to 300,000 people a year. We closed that visitor centre. That has a cafe, it has a shop, as does our other visitor centre. So there's a direct impact on our income through loss of sales in our shops, cafes, and also then we've, in the more recent weeks when the lockdown got more tight, we also then closed off the car parks, which was another source of income. So there's a direct net income loss that the Trust will suffer that will run into easily more than £100,000 this year just for our Trust. So that's a direct hit on our cash reserves of quite a substantial amount of money. And I guess the other thing that has also happened for us and others is that our other work hasn't gone away. So whereas we've had less resource, our colleagues in local authorities and others who haven't been furloughed are still sending planning applications for us to review, still asking us to comment and provide ecological input to those kinds of activities. So the rest of the unfurloughed world has carried on, but I've got a number of staff furloughed, which I'll say more about later perhaps, which means that our ability to respond and deliver has gone down. But I guess it's not all been bad. On the upturn of that, our communications, we've retained our communications staff and marketing staff, and our communications have gone up exponentially. Our engagement through Twitter, through Facebook, through our website. We've had a 16-fold increase in activity on our peregrine cam webcam, people just wanting to look at the peregrines nesting and laying eggs and etc. So there's been a massive increase in engagement, and what we're working on now is how we translate that uptick in engagement of quite substantial numbers into long-term supporters and engagement beyond this period.
The 30 Days Wild has just launched as well, which is must be a different experience to most years. Well, will be.
Yeah, so 30 Days Wild is a 30-day challenge starting on the 1st of June to do something, connect with wildlife on a daily basis every day in June, and it's something that the Wildlife Trust promote across the UK and also the Channel Islands and Crown dependencies. So it's a massive opportunity for us as well to think about that differently and how you engage people in a different way. And what we've seen in terms of the other positives is people have been finding solace in nature during this time. People have been contacting us about how important it's been. Our nature reserves on the whole have remained open, other than the 2 with car parks we've had to close. And we've had lots of engagement about how much people are valuing being out on those reserves for their own well-being. So that's been a massive thing that we've seen over the last 2 to 3 months.
Thanks very much. Martin, shall we move over to Wales? I saw you nodding a lot. Seems to be similarities there.
Well, I was reassuringly familiar, really, the experiences of you all, and it's been pretty much the same here, really. Tough and very challenging, and the virus itself is not very far away from connected family or friends, so you'll all have your own versions of that. I'm sure there are opportunities, and I guess we'll come into that when I think you're going to touch on rethinking the future later, Jason, maybe. But if I stand back from COVID just for a second, when the lockdown and office vacations that we've had to instigate as well started, we were just coming out of another incident related to floods. So some of our incident management staff were a bit knackered, quite frankly, coming off that and now into a fresh new incident situation, as we term it. So we were just starting to review that, and we were hit by COVID here, and of course Brexit has receded but will resurface quite soon because of the urgency on that timetable there. So we're starting to think about managing multiple incidents, as we would term them. And of course, our incident response capability as an organisation is pretty stretched because we're a Category 1 responder to things like pollution incidents and under the COMA regime and everything. So it's been quite stretching in that sense as well. So we've got an internal regime which is run by effectively an incident management group with some supporting topic cells, which is working really, really well, actually, backed up by some really good IT kit. And of course, we've got all 3 parts of Wales in drought terms went to developing drought status. So there's another little mini incident, or maybe a major one, coming up, because there's no rain in sight either for the coming 10 days or a couple of weeks, really. So that's just a bit of context to it as well. So we're having to manage quite dynamically, actually, what we're doing. We've had to repurpose some teams as they've all become home-based. Most people now, we've got some really good laptops, so people took home their laptops, but of course they find themselves at home in different circumstances with childcare, shielding responsibilities, in some cases self-isolation with COVID anyway. So we're running at about 85–90% of staff capacity at the minute. In terms of activities we're undertaking, we've had to kind of reprioritise, of course, but some of the activities have receded, particularly site and field-based work, obviously, particularly on private land, others' land. We can manage a bit better on our own land, the Welsh Government Woodland Estate and our NNRs, the 70 NNRs that we've got. But other areas of operations have actually accelerated at a time when we've got fewer staff to manage those operations. And I think of things like harvesting here, and you'll be familiar with the things, the kind of demand for forestry products, pallets and posts, pallets to support the big upshift in home delivery for food and other items as well. So you can see where all this material needs to come from somewhere. So our harvesting and thinning contractors are pretty much flat out at probably 120–130% of what we'd normally be. We're working with Welsh Government, local authorities and the National Park authorities on managing the closures around visitor centres and car parks and those hotspots, which we all originally had a bit of a problem with as the public came to terms with the restrictions, really. And of course, we're trying to keep an eye out for some of the NGOs part, really. We're working with them in Wales. Cross Wales Environment Link principally, who are the kind of umbrella body for the NGOs, you're having a massively tough time of it, as I know the National Trust, So we're arranging a package of funding to them at the minute, which will help either engage some NGO staff with us, directly on work with us, or somehow supporting good work by them when we start to emerge from lockdown now. And there's a Welsh Government announcement this Friday about their traffic lights approach to, some gradual unlocking. But I think it's really important because some of these ENGOs may not resurface if we're not careful, and we're really concerned that we need to work in partnership with these organisations in future. So we're doing our level best to put money their way to help support them through this problem. We've had some difficulties around forest fires. As you can imagine, some illegal burns beyond the April 1st burn regulations as well. Some really irresponsible illegal setting of fires, without naming individuals, but worked really well with the police and the fire and rescue services there when they're overstretched anyway in dealing with COVID. So some learning from that as well. And of course, we're starting to rethink the future now, but we've got a range of, and that's the really interesting conversation for me, really, because the planet and nature continues to give us brilliant feedback, doesn't it? Through things like floods and drought and everything. And we mustn't forget that we got nature and climate emergencies twin tracking here that we need to absolutely focus on. And that's where I'd hope that we can take the public. But, the causes of those two problems are effectively market economics and our economic model globally. And that's what we need to start to try and eat into and change slowly. And I'd love it if we got some leadership from all of our governments here and us as organisations to help start that gradual shift in that direction. Bearing in mind the sensitivities, of course, around people, not being out of work and everything, and the ill health and issues. But I absolutely think we've got to go in that direction.
Yeah, let's come back to that later. Paul Scott, can you have an Irish perspective?
Yes, I suppose the situation's been quite different in Ireland, quite unusual, because 109 days ago, I think it is now, before the lockdown started, we had a general election and there was no party with a majority, so we haven't had any new government formed since that time. So it's due to come to an agreement, according to the press, next week. But we'll wait and see on that. But as a result of that, so the old government is still in power and we still have the existing ministers in place. So I still have the same boss that I've had as I did last year. But without a sort of a firm government in place, it's been difficult to see where the future is. Now, just as we're dealing on a day-to-day basis, and the way COVID has affected my department, similar to the other speakers, first of all, there was a reprioritization to see where the emergencies lay, and to try and deal with the firefighting, as it were. Then we obviously realized that the need for staff to work remotely would require quite a major redeployment of IT resources. Unlike my previous life as an ecologist, everybody's office based and all the public services that we deliver were through offices in Dublin. And fortunately, we've been able to deliver those same services to the public remotely at home. It's been a pretty intensive period of time doing that and reallocating those resources. And on the back of that, and something which I never realized until I became a civil servant, all the legislation that allows a country to continue in the planning system, in particular to continue in normal times, all had to be rejigged, new legislation brought through to allow it to happen during this period of civil emergency, which is what it is. So allowing public participation to still take place when you can't get access to maybe council offices and things like that was quite a challenge, and that's the minister had to publish several orders to amend existing legislation. The first few weeks of the COVID-19 lockdown, there's quite a major reallocation or reassignment of staff for COVID-19 tracing. So quite a few civil servants who'll be from dealing with development plans and biodiversity plans were all reallocated to tracing for COVID-19 cases. So different government departments got a little bit of a shake-up to allow that allocation of priorities in dealing with the crisis. Now things have settled down somewhat. That contact tracing is also a settled process now. And the COVID-19 emergency legislation has all gone through. So we're looking now to see how we can come out of this and keep the wheels of government still rolling along And in the background, the politicians are still trying to agree on forming a government. And once that's all sorted out, then we'll have Brexit to deal with again. So it's we'll all be looking forward to that.
Thanks, Paul. Before we move on, just a reminder, please do ask your questions to the panel if you do have them. Shall we have a chat about research, maybe Steph and John, and the sort of impact that has had? Steph.
Yeah, so in terms of our research, it's been an interesting time working out what we can and what we can't continue with at the moment. Some of our researchers have been able to undertake a lot of their work really successfully from home. I was talking to one of my colleagues, Anjali Goswami, a couple of weeks ago, and because a lot of her work involves digital analysis, particularly of skull specimens. She's a morphometric specialist, runs the Goswami lab at the Natural History Museum. She and her team are very much able to work from home very effectively. Some of our other projects, however, that require access to labs or to a lot of field work that was planned for this year have had to take a slightly different approach. Some of those have had to pause entirely. I work on one project where we're partnered with London Wildlife Trust and Butterfly Conservation on a project called Brilliant Butterflies, which was a real combination of using novel metabarcoding and eDNA in the field with some fantastic habitat restoration work around the South Croydon area. And that field work has very much had to be delayed because of the need for social distancing and with all staff working remotely now. Probably our most major project that's been impacted has been the Darwin Tree of Life project that you might have heard of. That's a huge cross-institutional research project which is looking at full genome sequencing for all species, or majority of species in the UK. And of course, that was all supposed to start this year with genome blitzes happening across the country and researchers and surveyors going out collecting specimens as part of that research, just as the lockdown hit. So some of that work has been able to continue. Some of the staff have been starting some of that collecting even in their own back gardens, collecting specimens to go into our collections facility when we're able to return. But obviously it has got a knock-on effect on our research, and I have to admit I feel particularly sorry for our students who were relying on access to labs as part of time-limited projects and things like that, and how we deal with that going forward is a critical concept for us as we look at how we reopen and where the priorities are around reopening. Obviously that has knock-on effects in terms of funding for us, because a lot of our funding comes from research grants. And some of those research grants have been very, very flexible in terms of allowing us extensions on time. But of course, not every grant provider is able to offer additional resource as part of that, because they're being stretched in every direction as well. So that those time extensions might not necessarily come with funding. So we're working very closely with our partners for grant deliveries and on how we deal with that going forward. So it's been a very complicated time looking at what we can continue with, what does need to be put on pause, and where staff can be redeployed in terms of work on some of those research projects as well. So hopefully we will start to see some more progress on some of them fairly soon. We are working closely with the staff who are managing our estates to see how and when and what we need to change to allow us access to some of those facilities as we start to approach coming out of lockdown at the moment. But it's been a tricky one for research, certainly.
Right, thanks. John, from your perspective, you and your colleagues and then students and PhD students?
Very much reflects what Stephanie said. We've had, obviously, all the buildings have been closed down, so any lab access that has gone for, well, the university is starting to look at reopening, but we don't have a timescale for when people will be able to get back into labs yet. We've had to tell students not to go out in the field to collect data, obviously not to do any face-to-face interviews. So most aspects of staff and student research have pretty much come to a full stop. We do have some, bit like Stephanie was saying, doing sort of remote sensing projects, and obviously those can continue. Although that's thrown up quite an interesting issue of the quality of both staff and student access to the internet and to hardware, and that's going to be a real challenge going forward if we stay virtual. Some staff have just realized that their internet connections are not up to video conferencing and that sort of thing, so that's going to be a big issue. So yeah, it's pretty much stopped things for the time being, and it's really worrying because our undergraduates and masters would be wanting to do their fieldwork over this summer. Now some of them have to submit in September, and so there's that real uncertainty at the moment, and we don't quite know what we're going to do if it just proves to be impossible for them to get out and collect data in time to write up master's dissertations. Then the university is going to have to find a way of dealing with that, but it's such an uncertain time. We don't have answers to that at the moment. It's also affected, we have students go on international exchanges. Those have certainly been stopped up until Christmas. So some of our second year students would do 1 semester abroad, 1 semester in a placement, perhaps and one of my students is hoping to go to the local wildlife trust. So it's then a question of, are they going to be in a position to take students in September? Will it allow? No, it's just lots of uncertainty, and all those sorts of connections with museums, with wildlife trusts. We're all sort of feeling in the dark a bit here and trying to work out how we can give the students the best experience, but not quite knowing what the rules are going to be. So it's a real challenge.
Thanks. Would either Paul or Martin like to add anything on research? We'll move on. You mentioned fieldwork a bit there, so let's move on to that. I'm curious as to so CIEEM's received this letter from DEFRA. We've had communication with Welsh Government, Northern Ireland as well, which has allowed some ecological work to continue, but it seems there's been different interpretations from different sectors. So I'd be interested in how that approach has been taken in the different sectors. Anyone like to have a go at that?
I'll give it a go from the Welsh perspective. Given that we've got a devolved government here which is responsible for the environment, and I think there's an attempt, good attempts thus far about being in step with the 4 UK governments. But for us, the field work that we've done has to be considered essential activity. And for us, we've agreed with Welsh Government that would be things that are to protect public safety and health, protecting the environment, so we are able to attend and address pollution incidents and other regulated body incidents, for example, and the supply of essential products and services, which is where I touched on forestry earlier on. And generally, we're required to ensure good stewardship of our land in the Welsh Government Woodland Estate and our NNR. So if the activity fits in with any of those, well, most of those 4, if not all of them, then we're able to undertake it within some clear guidance we've issued to staff, but based on dynamic risk assessments as well, and adhering to the separation rules that are there. But what that leaves us with is very little site survey activity around protected sites, particularly where they're on private land, because landholders, owner-occupiers are very reluctant to have members of public bodies visit their land for good reason. So we've not been confrontational there at all. So, it's disappointing. We're in the peak of the field season where our staff are, champing at the bit to get out. They're desperate to get out, but can't, unless it's for a particular activity. We've done some tree marking, for example, around ash dieback and Carrara, disease that's killing ash, where there's a public liability. So we've had to do some work ahead of that, really, to mark those trees. We're trying to keep some contractor work going. We've got some metal mines work that's going on, remediation of metal mines. There's some survey work that we've allowed there for contractors, again, trying to keep SMEs up and running and going with some work. To inform some capital spend, because if we don't spend our budget this year, we won't get it next year from the government either. And COVID comes with a big bill anyway, so we're expecting a significant cut in GIA next year because of the bill that comes with COVID and the necessary redirection of funding from Welsh Government. But so we're going to have to reprioritise anyway. But hopefully with the announcement this Friday now, we'll be able to loosen up a little on some of the field work that we're being undertaken. We are doing bathing water surveys actually, so we're continuing that as the suite of that, so that we've got, because that supports tourism and economic development next year. So we thought that was really important to undertake that. So we will be starting that in mid to late June, I think. So, but other than that, most of our field monitoring and site-based work is on hold or stop at the minute, unless it's under those 4 categories of essential.
Yeah. Have you found any mismatches between consultancies continuing to do some surveys where they can safely and the impact on your work? Paul raised it around planning submissions still coming to them.
Yeah, we're involved in a couple of ourselves really, and there is some fast tracking of planning applications, understandably so, to get some regeneration and big infrastructure projects underway, and that does require some permissions for some surveys on our land and by contractors ourselves. But given that, you know, it's mainly the local authorities and Welsh Government that are dealing with the planning applications, there is some of that really, but I'm not aware of any massive inconsistency there really. I don't think.
Yep.
We're trying to facilitate it where we can, basically, and where it's safe to do so, because we recognise that at some point, you know, these projects with those 8-week turnarounds for some of the big projects are going to have to be done to support some regeneration beyond the immediate lockdown.
Yeah. Paul, there's Wilkinson. There was lots of nodding going in. Do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think picking up on Martin's point around the essential. What's essential? I think we classed kind of various areas of our work as business critical. And that involved our retaining our reserves management team. But that was really focusing their efforts down quite clearly on essential maintenance work. So they've been doing a shed load of fencing in terms of protecting areas where we've got livestock and things. And then in terms of that livestock, we've had staff doing the lambing and calving and things as clear animal welfare issues that we had to deal with all of that. And also then just essential elements of that work where we're receiving countryside stewardship funding and other, well, particularly countryside stewardship funding, and that we don't want to get behind and then have the Rural Payments Agency on our back, not missing our targets around condition and such like. So they've been focused on that. In terms of some of the field work, we're involved in a major Heritage Lottery funded project in the Sherwood Forest area, where we're leading on 2 of the work packages. One of those is around protected species, special species. So there's a lot of reptile survey work that was due to be taking place. We're planning an adder reintroduction project. So that was, we got a number of PhD students that were lined up to do some work around that, and they've unfortunately had to kind of withdraw some of their activity, which is a real shame. Going to put that work back. But we've started to reprofile that activity and started to reprogram it. And as government guidance has changed, we're now starting to deliver some of that reptile survey work, following all of the distancing and hand washing and all of those kinds of guidance, not having people travelling in the same vehicles and all of that kind of thing, or where people are doing things in solo, can do things solo or in pairs, keeping distance. So we're trying to get some of that survey work back up and running again. Another project that we're involved in is a badger edge vaccination scheme. So this is a DEFRA funded badger vaccination programme, which we've been running for a number of years now in South Notts, North Leicestershire. And that was very heavily affected initially by the lockdown, because it had to become desk based. So it was quite a lot of kind of planning activity for a lot of that, and contacting farmers and doing all of that remotely. But we've now started to bait the traps and get out there, and we've got a small handful of our volunteers going out individually or in small pairs, in pairs, to start that work. So we're starting to see a slight kind of increase in the amount of field activity that we're doing. But I think it has been a case of frustration. I think Martin said frustrated, and staff wanting to get out. And I think particularly as we've had such nice weather and the wildlife's been absolutely going bonkers in terms of kind of things appearing on reserves, kind of species that wouldn't normally nest or breed or ever have been turning up. And we've had staff that have just been champing at the bit. But I think our nature reserve team have had a wonderful time because there's been nobody else around, and they've been out on site seeing lots more wildlife. So yeah, overall, it's been, as everyone else has described, quite limited.
Jason, can I just quickly there, I painted a rather grim picture of our monitoring and site-based work, but we do have, however, have a project that we're running behind with, which is effectively a rapid review of the condition of protected sites in Wales across the suite. And it's desk-based, and because of the reduction in field work, we've been able to repurpose and reprioritise our staff onto finishing this work, and we're really accelerating on it now. So we hope to finish it by the middle of June. So that will inform our future management work. So that's one of the bright spots, actually. And some of my staff in my teams, well, across all teams in Wales, actually have been helping out the wildlife trusts, keeping an eye on the reserves where we can and reporting any antisocial behaviour or, raptor persecution we've had a bit of a problem with. But yeah, so not all grim.
Great, thanks. Paul, Scott.
In terms of data, actually, sorry, Jason, just in terms of data, one of the things that we have noticed, and I think Paul Wilkinson alluded to it earlier on, is the interest in the general public and suddenly what's in their gardens and what they are seeing now that they're more connected to the natural history that's out of their window. And we've managed to get some real interest in biological recording from people's gardens, generated through some of the online content that we've been producing, particularly at an accelerated rate during lockdown, because that is obviously our main way that we can now connect with our audiences. Particularly through things like citizen science, we're seeing a real upturn in people wanting to submit data, which of course helps with our research. We were recently involved in the City Nature Challenge, which was at the end of April, and we had more people than ever submitting data through the iNaturalist app as part of that, which was really interesting to see that sudden upturn in people contributing their own records to our data collection, which is fantastic to see. And also a real upsurge in people looking for help and advice in identification for what they are finding when they are out in their gardens and looking out of the window. We've created a new Facebook group so that people can connect more easily with our ID service, because we were getting a lot of inquiries as people are suddenly seeing new things to them, being more observant out in their own field sites, if you like, in their back gardens.
Thanks. Paul, Scott, did you want to add anything on field work before we move on?
Yeah, I suppose it's of interest to me as a former ecological consultant. Some of my colleagues have anecdotally told me that before the 18th of May, which is when some of the restrictions were eased in Ireland, there was occasional ecological survey going on for what regarded to be very high-profile, important infrastructure projects, and also interesting there was quite a lot of pressure put on the delivery of renewable energy projects as well, given some of the seasonal restrictions for breeding bird surveys and things like that. But from what I gather, there's been an increased level of activity of surveys since the 18th of May. Now, the problem is the resources in getting all the necessary surveys done at the correct time of year to make a valid application or to make a valid baseline data set. And I think that's got a lot of concerns that some developers have, and getting that level of certainty that their applications are going to be valid when it hits the desks of the planning authorities. I have heard of some people wanting the planning authorities to be a little bit more pragmatic, some might say lenient, in terms of the level of information that's provided. I don't think that's going to happen. I think there's a lot of people sitting in Ireland who will, a lot of potential objectives to schemes that will pay a lot of attention to the detail of baseline data that's been collected. But look, we have to think about this in the time of year that this has happened. It's obviously we've lost the spring survey season for a lot of taxa groups, so it's we have to just look forward in the summer and seeing how we can catch up on that data.
There will be the Irish version of the alternative approaches guidance coming out soon, hopefully this week. So that should be helpful. Yeah. Did anyone else want to add anything on field work? We can move on. I'm curious around how things have changed. It's been mentioned a little bit around staffing, resources. Paul mentioned volunteers earlier, and then sort of funding and finances and how that has changed and what the impact has been. It's been mentioned a little bit before. Does anyone want to elaborate on any of those aspects?
I can jump in. Paul, go for it.
No, go on, you, Steph. Go for it.
Okay. So I was just going to say, so in terms of the museum, obviously staff costs are a significant proportion of what we do, and there are some staff who, say, for example, our front of house staff simply aren't able to work at the moment. So we furloughed around 450 members of staff. Now that's about half of our staff capacity, and that has been right across all of the teams, including some of our curators and teams like that. So it has had an impact on us. Not all of those staff have been furloughed for the entire period up to the end of June. Some are completing work and finishing at the end of this week, for example, and then being furloughed for a month. So that has altered how we're able to work and who we're able to work with across teams. But fundamentally, the support of our directors has been fantastic, actually, in communicating what's necessary and when furloughing is and isn't going to happen. And that's been really useful. A lot of people have mentioned IT capacity, and actually our IT department were in the middle of a rollout of laptops to a lot of staff. So that was rather fortuitously timed, because it does mean that they were right on the case from very early on in terms of enabling us to work from home with the right technology to be able to access all of our files remotely from wherever we've all ended up working. So that's been incredibly useful. But actually the museum's response to this in terms of staff has been fantastic. While our staff are furloughed, they are furloughed on 100% of their salary, so no one's actually lost out by it. We have all been asked to take time off so that we at least get some break and respite for those of us who are working, and obviously some of us have been redeployed to different streams of work, or focusing on new aspects of work and taking an opportunity to look at different parts of their work. For example, me, I'm very much focusing on developing new online training capacity, which was further down my work stream than it originally was this year. So there have been a lot of changes to enable us to work remotely. People looking at data sets in different ways, but fundamentally, actually, I've got to really wave the flag for the response of our IT departments and our directors in making sure, and HR actually, in making sure that we look after our staff really well during lockdown, which has been fantastic. Similar to, I think, Paul, you mentioned our volunteers, which we're staying in touch with our volunteers, but obviously there's not so much that we're able to do, and with so many staff furloughed, quite often they are volunteer managers who have been furloughed, including our main volunteer manager. So yeah, so we've got we're keeping in touch with our volunteers, but not regularly asking them to volunteer for us as we're currently working. And then of course our students that I've already mentioned as well. So yeah, so it's been a mixed approach to different teams and different work streams, but it's actually working very well. And what has been fantastic for me, just in terms of working in the museum, to see is how much that community of staff across the museum have all pulled together to really make this work. And the amount of people offering, contributing in new ways to the museum has been fantastic to see, actually, and really, really heartening. The amount of passion there is for the Natural History Museum, very much within the staff, has sort of helped us through all of this, which is really good. That's
great. Paul Wilkinson, you wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, no, I think I think the furlough point, in the early stages, early iterations, and this is all very fast moving, I understand that charities weren't included as part of the organisations that could access the furloughing system, and that changed to our great delight, because without it we would have been in really serious trouble. So we have taken advantage of that as far as we felt able, whilst maintaining those business critical functions. But for us, that was 53% of the staff. So from our perspective, that's 45 individuals. The majority of those were from our trading companies, because we didn't have retail and catering and all those kind of visitor experience stuff. So there's quite a lot of that number is relating to their work. But there was every bit of the organisation, the trading company, the consultancy, and the charity were all had staff furloughed. But I think just touching on what Stephanie mentioned about the engagement, staff engagement, we set up an internal Facebook group for all staff. So that worked really well, and it's still going, still lots of things being posted up. That's something just a bit more informal rather than my kind of weekly emails to everyone updating people on the more kind of formal front. But we're having the kind of fortnightly all staff Zoom meetings where we're getting kind of 50, 60 people on a Zoom call to take part in that. So I think the furlough thing has worked very well from our perspective. I guess the other thing that's been a noticeable change is our funders are particularly the Heritage Fund and the Big Lottery Now Communities Fund, who have pooled all of their resources back now from all of their different funding streams into these emergency grants around coronavirus impact. So we had a couple of Heritage Lottery funds in the pipeline that have now been postponed. So their progress of those projects has been delayed indefinitely, potentially September. But talking to the various kind of people within the Heritage Fund, there's still some uncertainty about when their normal funding might get up and running again. So they're a major funder of our sector, quite clearly. 20-30% of their funding goes to natural heritage projects. So that's a big slug of money that it won't be coming to those projects this year. But we are applying to the Heritage Emergency Fund, and we put an application in last week. So we're hopeful that we'll get something out of that to cover the immediate costs and impact that the virus has had. So I think that's kind of been a noticeable change across the funding network. A number of grant-making trusts have continued to fund the things that they were funding before the virus hit. So that's been a great relief that we've had some of our normal grants coming through. But I think the biggie is the Heritage Fund, and totally understand and support why they've done that. But I think that is something that will cause delay within the system for a number of projects across the areas that they fund.
Am I right in thinking that government's added a charity grant as well to the funding schemes, support schemes?
The charity grant, sorry, what was the charity grant?
So in the government grant schemes, I think there's a charity version been added as well now?
Yeah, well, there's the business, so there's the retail, hospitality and leisure grants are available to charities as well. So we've applied for those, yeah.
Thanks. John, was there anything you wanted to add on this kind of aspect from a university perspective?
I mean, I'm not really involved at that level, but normally universities would have summer schools running over the summer with a lot of overseas students, and clearly that's had to stop. Who knows what this is going to affect it's going to have on students, whether they're going to take a year out if they don't fancy a virtual experience. So at the moment, numbers look to be fine, but I guess they're going to make their decisions nearer the time. So it will have had a big impact on universities, but I'm not really involved with that sort of level of discussion.
Are you aware of any staff being furloughed from the university?
I'm not, no. I'm assuming with all the sort of catering staff and all those ancillary staff, then it may have happened, but it's not something I've heard anything about. Certainly all the academics, all the technical staff have been kept on because so much is still having to happen, so much planning is needed for next year.
Great. So I'm keen, I'm aware we're running out of time, so I'm keen for us to talk about the future and recovery and what we've learned and how we move forward from this. So I suppose the sort of question right here and now, as we've talked about, we've seen nature coming back, we've seen better air quality. Is what have we learned from this that we can take forward as we reopen things? And what do we want to hang on to from that, and how do we do that? Martin,
I think Martin touched on it earlier, and I think that the fact that the climate and ecological crisis hasn't gone away is something that we've had to keep reiterating during this time. So I think the thing we want to hang on to is that connectedness with nature that people have been telling us all about, and how we build that connectedness and that inquisitiveness and kind of care for the natural world that people have started to develop, how we nurture that and mobilize that in order for there to be more people in the future that are going to stand up, ask questions, challenge decision makers to make better decisions. We've various discussions around a kind of building back better and a greener recovery And I think we've got to keep some pressure on in all of those areas to make sure that just the kick-starting of the economy isn't done at the cost of the natural world. Kick-starting the road schemes, the infrastructure schemes, housing development, etc. It can't just be a return to the business as normal. We've got to be building in better consideration of the natural world into all of those decisions. So I think from our perspective, we're trying to nurture and galvanise that additional support, and then try and direct it and mobilise it in the best possible way to enable those bigger policy and political shifts to occur.
So if you take the original, the initial, that interest that was built, and hang on to that and use that as behaviour change and public influence later.
No, absolutely. Well said, Paul. And I can see nodding of heads there, really. It's for me, it's about what do we want to leave behind? Things like, poor air quality, congestion, lack of time, because the time's allowed us everybody to reconnect with nature. So all that's in the positive ledger there. There's some behavioural science in it for me, around getting, not us telling the public what's good for them around climate and nature. I think they're feeling it at the minute, that there are some definitely different ways in which we can work and operate and live. So it's what we want to leave behind and what we want to take up with us. We're managing the present, but we need to kind of shape this future, really. And that could be, influencing the discussion around Brexit. For Welsh Government, it's around looking at the manifestos at the minute for the next May government elections. Post-Brexit land management schemes, to succeed what's currently going to stop. We're not going to be able to access life projects from July onwards. But generally speaking, talking in the language around environment for growth and a green recovery, and that could be work which will involve the kind of skills that CIEEM has got, really: consultancies, enlightened architects, urban designers, green infrastructure experts, habitats and species experts, and across the sectors, public, private and third, and the NGOs, to just try and make a kind of collective contribution to promoting regeneration in a greener way. And that could be to do with green corridors and regeneration around towns and cities, to help sustain that connection that the public have got, really, through the current crisis, really, and get some good out of it. But I'm not that confident that the rethink itself will be driven by central and Welsh Government. There's an appetite in Wales, but whether they can push it through, because there's some really hard-nailed jobs and employment and income and health issues to be tackled. But I think there's a way of doing it that can be beneficial all around, really. That's what I'm hoping for.
On that planning aspect, then, Paul, how do you see this happening in Ireland?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I echo Martin's comments on this. I mean, it is a good time to capitalise on some of the messages that are being coming through. People desiring to go to natural spaces, people just wanting a little bit of green space around them, is going to force some architects to maybe pay a little bit more emphasis on the amount of distancing and space that they put around private developments. There is a huge, or that there has been for the last 3-4 years, a huge effort to try and increase the amount of housing in Ireland, and a focus on increasing the densities within urban cores. I think what this is going to focus in is, what the COVID crisis has focused in is making sure we can do that sustainably, but also allowing opportunities for access to green space where people need it. What's been very interesting in Ireland is, because of the lack of traffic on the roads, whether it's a pure coincidence, a lot of the councils, particularly Dublin City Council and Dunleer Rathdown Council, which is another part of the Dublin conurbation, they've been pushing through a lot of their cycling and footpath widening initiatives that they've been looking to do for ages. So when we all get back to work, we're going to find that actually there's going to be counter-flow lanes for cyclists, and everyone will be going the wrong way up one-way streets. But joking aside, that's the amount of cyclists on the street is going to change. The attitudes to public transport are probably going to change as well. Ireland is still a car-driven transport system, and once you're outside Dublin, it's very difficult and very challenging to move around the country by car without a car. So I think that's something that's going to be paying attention to as well.
John, your views from an academic perspective?
Well, I mean, certainly over the summer, there's going to have to be a lot of looking at how we deliver materials and how we can create and retain engagement. And I hope there'll be some positive things come out of that we maybe will continue to use. so much of what we do is about getting groups of students to interact between themselves and with us, and that's so much harder online. So there's going to have to be a lot of head scratching, and some of the software I can see maybe will allow more interaction. Some of the using Zooms for meetings with students when they can't get into class, because a lot of our students travel a long way, and actually sometimes is it going to be better just to do that than to have them come in just for a tutorial with me, but not losing the group interactions. So I think there will be lessons to learn, but I don't quite know what they are yet.
Steph, should we come to you last?
Okay, so I mean, I think there's a lot of different aspects that are really quite positive actually coming out of what is obviously a terrible and tragic situation that's befallen us. But and as a lot of our colleagues up on the talk today have already alluded to, there are ways of working which can hopefully be maintained as we come out of lockdown, things which will change our impact on the climate, on the environment, and also how the public particularly are perceiving issues around the planetary emergency. Back at the start of the year, with the launch of our new strategy, we made a very clear statement that a lot of our research and focus for the museum was going to be around the planetary emergency, the impact that we have as humans changing our environment and changing our biodiversity. And this has really brought home to us as an institution, but also our audiences, how important it is to understand what that planetary emergency really means, and the importance of connecting good research with good practical applications, with policymakers, with decision makers, and the public as well, very much all forming part of that conversation. And it's taking that conversation forward now and how we address that. The term that we use in the strategy is around creating advocates for the planet, but I see that as advocates at all elements within that, advocates in research and science, advocates in practical habitat management and conservation, advocates at the decision-making level, and advocates very much within the general public. We've shown that we can communicate with our audiences in a very different way in this situation that we find ourselves in, and hopefully we can take that forward. We've shown that there are new ways of working which allow more people to interact with what we're doing as an institution remotely in ways that they wouldn't necessarily have been able to do pre-lockdown, because getting to, for example, South Kensington and London is very difficult, expensive, and for many people impossible. We've been able to reach out to a lot more people. And actually for a lot of our staff, some people who have struggled to get in with rising public transport costs, the difficulty of getting into London, the difficulty of managing childcare and managing disabilities and things like that. It has highlighted that as an institution, we can work well remotely. So there's a lot of positives that we can take away from this difficult situation, which has created a different way of working, which hopefully we're going to be able to maintain long term. And I hope above everything else that what that generates is people understanding the need to investigate this planetary emergency fully and turn that science into actual practical changes throughout all of our lives.
Thanks. So we're running just a couple of minutes over time. Does anyone have anything else to add as a final remark before I wrap things up? Well, thank you to all of you. Let's just go back to the slides. So just very much leading on from that conversation, our next Extra Streams episode 5 will be on planning for recovery and COVID and how we come out of this. That's going to be on the 17th of June, 12 noon as per normal, and you can find that online in our events in the normal place. And then just finally, just to say thank you very much for the panel, my colleague Amber online as well, and for all of you listening in, great. We'll put this up online. It'll go onto the Resource Hub as usual with all of the others as a resource freely available. If you have any feedback on today or any of the previous episodes, or if you'd like to see particular future topics, please do let us know. And if you can send those into inquiries at CIEEM, that would be great. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your days. Thanks. Good day.
Thank you.